Welcome, welcome to our Neurodiversity and Mental Health webinar. My name is Martina and I'm a counseling psychologist working for the Wellbeing Line. This webinar is about 30 minutes long and is focused on the mental health of people who are neurodivergent. So why are we discussing it? There is lots of misunderstanding of neurodiversity. Neurodivergence is not a mental illness. While our understanding of neurodiversity evolves, we are aiming to dispel some of the myths around neurodivergency and poor understanding. Conflating neurodivergence with mental illness leads to misinformation and harmful attitudes towards those who do not present as neurotypical. I'm not here as a specialist in neurodiversity, but as a specialist in mental health and well-being, and we know from the evidence that neurodivergent people are at increased risk of experiencing mental health struggles and mental illness. What we are presenting is intended to dispel some of the myths, provide information, and set the scene for a discussion between us. We recognize that many of you will have lived experiences, and please consider these when you are thinking about your knowledge and experiences. So what we aim at is to dispel some of the myths. We consider the impact neurodivergence might have on mental health and hopefully will be enabling discussions about strengths and challenges, as well as mental health of those who are neurodivergent. When it comes to terminology, this continues to be confusing, as it is very often used interchangeably. For the purpose of today, we want to clarify how we will be using the terminology and acknowledge that some people will choose to use different terminology. When we think about neurodiversity, this is the concept that everyone's brain is unique, and it was coined by Judy Zinger. We are all diverse, we all think, learn, and act differently, and we all have different strengths. Neurodiversity recognizes and celebrates the value that these different strengths can bring. Neurodivergence is the term for when someone's brain processes, learns, and perhaps behaves differently from what is considered typical. Neurodivergent means that a person's brain works in a way that is not expected. It is commonly used when the behavior or response differs from what is expected socially, physically, or verbally. Some people will have a diagnosis, such as autism or ADHD, but many will be neurodivergent and do not have a diagnosis. In a truly neuro-inclusive world, there would be no need for a diagnosis, but it is often the case currently that having one helps someone to get the support they need. Neurotypical. A neurotypical person is an individual who thinks, perceives, and behaves in ways that are considered to be a societal norm by the general population. Institutions such as schools, sports leagues, and places of employment are typically designed to accommodate people who fit into these norms. So neurodiversity refers to a variety of neurological differences. So let's look at the next slide. We hope that this will be a space where people can feel quite comfortable learning. Nothing is intended to be difficult, but we will be talking about well-being and potential difficulties around mental health. So please do look after yourself. So why are we talking about this now? Neurodiversity is discussed more, famous people share their diagnosis, struggles, strengths. So we can definitely see that there is an increased awareness of neurodiversity. It is estimated that 15 to 22% of the world population has some form of neurodivergence. In Britain, it is estimated around 10% of population. There is also consideration that perhaps these figures are higher in healthcare organization, which is where we deliver this webinar. And a very recent research shows that well-being at work is worse for those who are neurodivergent workers than those who are neurotypical. So this slide highlights some statistics for different neurodivergent conditions that can be diagnosed. So let's consider the first one, dyslexia. It is estimated that 1 in every 10 people in the UK will struggle with dyslexia. Dyslexia really kind of means specific learning difficulties connected to reading and writing. We can see that 60% of people with dyslexia might also have learning difficulties around mathematics. So let's consider the next one, and this is dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is also known as developmental coordination disorder and commonly impacts movement and coordination. Again, if we look at the statistics, it is estimated that about 6% of population is affected, and 50% of those with dyspraxia will also struggle or will have ADHD. Dyscalculia is the next specific disorder. It's very persistent difficulty in understanding numbers, which will kind of will lead to number of different difficulties with mathematics. It is not related to age or level of education. We can see that 3% of population are affected. Dyscalculia also recently went through redefinition, so we don't really have appropriate numbers under the new diagnosis of dyscalculia. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, really quite often people with ADHD may present as restless, have difficulties concentrating, and act on impulse. There is lots of different other symptoms, but we can see that 3 to 4% of adult population in the UK might be affected. Autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is neurodevelopmental condition characterized by decreased social communication, the presence of repetitive or stereotypic behaviors. But we can also see that estimated 1.1% of adult population in the UK might struggle with ASD. So for the purpose of today, we are talking about mental health in general and common mental disorders in particular. However, we acknowledge that there is comorbidity between neurodivergence and a wider range of mental health diagnoses. There can still be taboo around the word mental health. We all have mental health, just as we have physical health. So it's really important we look after our mental health. We can see that 1 in 4 people will experience mental health problem of some kind each year in England, and it is estimated that 1 in 6 adults have experienced a common mental disorder, for example, depression and anxiety, in the past week, so quite high numbers. It is clear that people who are neurodivergent experience mental health issues more often than those who are neurotypical. So let's look at some comorbidity. Up to 50% of autistic people experience depression at some point in their lives. Up to 50% of those with ADHD experience 1 or more anxiety disorders. Adults with diagnosis of SAD experience high rates of comorbid anxiety and depression, and dyslexia can also lead to mental health challenges. So it's really clear that there is quite high comorbidity. So let's look at some overlap. So when we think about depression, this is a mood disorder. It's very much a persistent feeling of sadness and hopelessness, loss of joy, pleasure from activities. What we can observe is sadness, and what we see in depression, sadness is a core symptom. In neurodiversity, sadness can and will vary. Other overlap between depression and neurodivergence is sleep difficulties, poor food intake, social isolation, sensory sensitivities, irritability, tearfulness. So we can see that there is quite a lot when it comes to depression. Let's look at social anxiety disorder. This is also a mental disorder with long-term and overwhelming fear of social situation. As much as 50% of people with autism might struggle with social anxiety, and we can observe quite often difficulties in social interaction. In social anxiety disorder, this fear is very much centered around fear of being judged, fear of being the center of attention, rumination over social interactions. Within that neurodivergent population, there might not be desire to be social. There are difficulties in reading social cues and easily being overstimulated. Overlap then is social withdrawals, difficulty communicating with others, struggling in bigger groups, poor eye contact. When we look at obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, what's typical is that person with OCD will have unwanted or repeated thoughts, feelings, and images or sensations, which are the obsessions. And they will engage in order to manage these, they will engage in behaviors or mental acts, therefore compulsions. Therefore, we can see or observe repetitive behaviors. In OCD, these repetitive behaviors exist to reduce anxiety, and they are directly linked to a specific fear. In autism, the repetitive behaviors might be more self-soothing through rituals, routines, and stimming. In ADHD, on the other hand, it can be a coping strategy that will aid focus. Again, in terms of overlap, difficulty sleeping, difficulties tolerating uncertainty, repetitive thinking, when that person cannot just let go of that idea. So why is there such a high prevalence? There is still lots of stigma surrounding neurodivergence and different diagnoses, because these very often focus on challenges and misunderstanding of different conditions, which can lead to increased stress. And that inner critic might also increase a feeling of worthlessness, isolation, and people might struggle with seeking support. When we think about negative attitudes from other people who may not actually understand or accept the differences, people with neurodivergence might experience discrimination, which can lead to loneliness and difficulties with mental health. People might also differ in interacting with the world. It might be very difficult to navigate places that don't meet our sensory processing or communication needs. So, for example, for someone who is neurotypical, public transport is not an issue. For someone who is neurodivergent, this might be a real source of stress. Difficulties making phone calls or filling up particular forms. We can see that there is still lots of misdiagnosis, and as there is big overlap between some of the mental health diagnoses, mental health issues, and neurodivergence. This also potentially can lead to experiences that might be mistaken for mental health issues or mental health problems, and it might be much harder to get the right help, which will in turn contribute to stress and anxiety. We can see that it can be potentially difficult to get the right support, to get the right diagnosis, which can then lead to being moved from service to service. Mental health and social care services might not quite understand how to best support the person with neurodivergence, and some people, some services might just not be able to offer appropriate support. I would like to consider masking. Masking is appearing normal, where people observe patterns to try to fit into that neurotypical world. And this takes lots and lots of energy. Over time, the effort required to mask can lead to emotional and physical exhaustions and potentially to burnout. And as we talk about masking, this is really difficult. Therefore, I would like us to just for a moment consider strengths of some of the neurodivergent conditions. If we consider these and draw on the strengths of the individuals, we might enable them to be more open, engage in less masking, and hopefully this might act as a protective factor when managing their mental health. So we can see, looking at dyslexia, people are generally seen as quite creative and empathic. Someone with ADHD, the high energy levels, the ability to hyper-focus, thinking on their feet. And we know that people with ADHD generally shows high levels of resilience. Someone with autism, absolutely important, analytical thinking, attention to detail, long-term memory, and so much more than what's on this slide. So how can we support a neurodivergent colleague? Each person is unique in their experiences, ways of thinking, processing information, and managing difficulties. So what we suggest is holding the individual in mind with a trauma-informed lens, knowing that anybody could be impacted by anything at any point in life. We really would like to consider well-being conversation. This might be informal or much more formal, and it is good practice to change culture and normalize conversations about well-being. However, some neurodivergent people might not have met with understanding and consideration of their challenges and may not be used to having these conversations. Curiosity, be curious, approach what you observe with curiosity. We never know what is really going on for the person. Explore individual challenges and strengths. You might already be aware of challenges, but consider what that person is good at. Ask them if possible. We hope that you can foster a safe environment, and we will talk about this further in the presentation. And also consider other sources of support. You are not the only source of support for this particular person, and we will also talk about this a bit further. So how to foster a safe environment? Promoting neuro-inclusivity is a journey that starts with open and respectful conversation. Can you meet all of the individual's needs and preferences all of the time? Probably not. But can you create a safe culture where people know they are respected, valued, and accommodated where possible? Yes, absolutely. So what we really would like you to consider is different opportunities to check in with individuals, whether that's through appraisal, supervision, reflective practice, and ad hoc check-ins. It is also important to gain permission to talk and think about where this conversation will take place and some timing. So it's safe for that person to talk, whether that's psychologically or physically. And we can ask questions. What strategies and tools do you find most helpful? Is there anything I could do to support you? Would it be helpful for us to talk about these things? We recognize that some people might have some natural worries about opening these types of conversations, particularly if we have noticed that someone is struggling or they have come to you and shared with you that they are struggling. These worries can sometimes be amplified if the person we are wanting to talk to is neurodivergent, or we suspect they might be. Sometimes we just have to be brave, and provided we are coming from a place of compassion and we are motivated to support rather than judge the person, then that will gradually help us to create change in the culture. We might worry about saying the wrong thing or not knowing what to say or how to say it. Are we using the correct terminology? Getting ourselves caught in all this rather than just offering a space for people to share how they are feeling. We might worry that we make things worse, or we fear that we don't know what to say, or that the other person is going to say something, especially when the conversation is unplanned. But actually what's really important is that anyone can have one of these conversations. It is about offering that safe space, and we'll talk about tips a little bit later. Considering if you are the right person, if you know the person, and consider that you can support them, that's really important. Concerns about appropriateness or becoming over-involved, Remember, this is just a conversation. You don't have to solve everything in this moment or offer counseling or therapy. Recognizing not everyone knows where to turn, and we can use this conversation or take some time after to think or research for appropriate support and signpost people later. So how can we prepare for this conversation? How do we slow ourselves down and create space to have these conversations? What do we already know? Do we know about any current stressors, difficult circumstances for this person? Is this the first time this type of conversation is happening? It's also important and helpful to clarify expectation, ensuring the person knows this is not punitive or a disciplinary, it's a checking, but also that it's not a counseling session. We can prepare ourselves because we are more likely to have a helpful and productive conversation if we are calm. So calming that fight or flight response, that stress response, bringing in compassion to ourselves, recognizing we are not necessarily experts in mental health, but we can have a big impact by opening this conversation. So how might we begin or approach the conversation? It can be helpful to think about this in advance where possible. And might need to also consider how we approach this. And again, we'll talk about some of these ideas later on. Think about the right place to have the conversation. How can we create that safe space for this person? Remember, you don't have to be the whole support for that person. You are just one piece of the puzzle. You don't have to have all the answers or manage this on your own. You can encourage people to reach out for themselves for additional support. This is also about widening out the responsibility to protect yourself as well, so that it doesn't all sit with you. So check-ins are really important. Who else can support this particular person? What other support is out there and available to this person? It is important to ask the person what support they already have, because this might prompt them to think and clarify for themselves. And you could then talk through any blocks for them using this support. For example, I don't want to be a burden. Also, there are dedicated services to support individuals who make use of them, whether that is for advice or signposting. There are in-moment support helplines as well, and long-term support is available, which you can see on the slide. What we would like you to remember is that neurodivergence is not a mental illness. There is huge overlap between different diagnoses, and you don't need to work out what's neurodiversity, what's mental health issues. It's about being curious. While our knowledge of neurodiversity has improved, there is still a lot of stigma around neurodiversity as well as mental health. We hope that this will enable you, together with your colleagues, create neuro-inclusive environment, safe space to discuss any issues and consider individual strengths. Thank you very much for watching this webinar. And if you'd like to hear some more or contact the Wellbeing, here are our contact details. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.